The Glazers, Ed Woodward, on-pitch product being a shadow of what it once was, seemingly sacrificed for commercial revenue. All the while, a club that hadn't carried any debt since the early 1930s suddenly has hundreds of millions of pounds of it, thanks to their much maligned owners. Hi there, I'm Adrian and welcome to Rabona TV, where today we'll be looking at the Glazers, Ed Woodward, how the American owners managed to make money off of a debt-ridden club such as Manchester United, and so much more. We're going deep with this one to try to make the murkiness of the Glazer ownership and Manchester United's financials much clearer for you, while also exposing some things that have frankly gone unreported thus far, or at least underreported thus far with relation to how the Glazers continue to profit from a club that, again, is so saddled with debt. Thankfully, I had a lot of help with this video as it was produced in collaboration with RISC Vision, a powerful tool for modeling and monitoring the financial and operational health of companies. RISC Vision monitors commercial property tenants, supply chains, and investment portfolios. And of course, they even monitor all of the football clubs in the Premier League. It's been fascinating looking behind the curtain of the financials and the structures of the various clubs. So use the link in the description to check out their product demo video, as well as their website at www.riscvision.com. With that said, let's go back to 2003. As the head of the Glazer financial empire, Malcolm first started making a name for himself in the New York business world via real estate investing, then moving into media, and eventually the purchase of NFL franchise the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Under the Glazer family's guidance, they won their first Super Bowl in 2003, the same year that the Glazers began their takeover of Manchester United. Glazer announced on September 26, 2003 that he had a 3.17% stake in Manchester United via the shares he had purchased. A year later, in October of 2004, he had raised his shareholdings to 28% and provided a takeover proposal to the Manchester United board. This was ultimately turned down by the board on October 25, 2004, as they claimed that the takeover proposal that was offered by Glazer in order to purchase the remaining shares of the club would require a large amount of debt. By early February of 2005, another proposal was submitted, of which Manchester United's chief executive at the time, David Gill, said that the revisions were, quote, aggressive, end quote, and, quote, potentially damaging, end quote, to the long-term future of the club. As the Glazers gained more of a stranglehold over the club via their share acquisition, the takeover seemed more and more imminent, but in a manner that would be considered, the ugly way among supporters. Manchester United had been a debt-free club since 1931, but this proposed takeover from Glazer would see them take out loans to buy the club. Loans taken out against the club's assets, meaning the liability would fall upon the club to pay them back, not on the Glazers. They continued to increase their stake in United, reaching the point in which they could delist the club from the London Stock Exchange in 2005. Their takeover was highly leveraged. Leveraged meaning that they used borrowed money, which again was borrowed against the club's assets and thus on the club's books, not on the Glazers' books. But how did this entire process affect their financial standing? With all of this turmoil behind the scenes, failed takeovers, chairman stepping down, the shoveling of debt onto this previously debt-free club. Thanks to this chart from RISC Vision, we can see the trend in their credit ratings. Now, of course, a credit rating is, as said on Investopedia, a quote, quantified assessment of the credit worthiness of a borrower in general terms or with respect to a particular debt or financial obligation. A credit rating can be assigned to any entity that seeks to borrow money, an individual, a corporation, a state or provincial authority, or a sovereign government. So this representation shows how their financial standing has fluctuated over the years, their ability to pay back debts, late payments, etc. All of these things factor into their score. As you can see, in 2002, their score was high at 87. Perhaps they had boosted it with some payments being made on time or something like that. But between then and 2007, while the Glazers were in the process of taking over the club and the talk of borrowing gargantuan amounts of money, their credit ratings dropped to 50. Low. Very low. In fact, the lowest it had dropped during the Glazer takeover, which lasted about 2 years. Scores in this area are considered just to be fair. By no means at emergency levels, but they are definitely not considered to be a good credit score. All throughout these peaks and valleys of the takeover, a banker from Chelmsford guided the Glazers along, advising them on how they should go about acquiring this storied club. Ed Woodward was born and raised in Chelmsford and attended Bristol University to study physics, a physicist that found himself at one of the big four accounting firms via PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC, before settling in at JP Morgan Chase, the massive investments firm, in 1999. Woodward worked in the international mergers and acquisitions team and served as an advisor to the Glazers as they were purchasing shares in the club, helping them to navigate their takeover. Here's what David Kahn of The Guardian wrote in 2019. Woodward, who worked on the United acquisition for the Glazers and their late father Malcolm while at the bank JP Morgan, came up with the £275 million payment-in-kind hedge fund loans at an initial 14.25% interest to bridge the gap with a £265 million bank loan and £270 million the family itself put in. When the debts were refinanced a year later, the hedge fund debts had escalated by $79.1 million, which included a $13.2 million charge for early redemption. As for Woodward, he was rewarded for his role in the acquisition with a job in Manchester United's setup, and in 2007, he became the head of Manchester United's commercial operations. Utilizing his clear talent when it came to securing funds, as he had done for the Glazers, Woodward helped grow Manchester United's commercial revenue by 48% in 2010, while income from media rights increased by 37%. The revenue streams Woodward helped to bolster had grown from £48.7 million to £117.6 million by the time 2012 had come around. Because of this, he began to advance his standing within the club. Checking back on the credit scores delivered by RISC Vision to put this into context, you can see that in 2008, United's score had shot up to 87, but dipped down to 65 as of January of 2010. Woodward's work on the commercial side was clearly bearing fruit, but with the release of the financial records for 2009 in January of 2010 showing that United's debt had grown, the credit instability remained. 2010 was a volatile year in this regard. But for Woodward, he continued to shoot up the ranks within Manchester United Football Club. As you can see here via RISC Vision's board turnover and directorship data, Ed Woodward has worn many hats within the entire organization. On May 9th of 2008, he became the director of Alderley Urban Investments, the real estate investment portion of Manchester United FC Limited. In June of 2010, he became the director of Manchester United TV. He was elected to the executive board of Red Football Holdings Limited, becoming the executive vice chairman of the club. And in 2013, he became the chief executive of the club, the most senior role when it comes to the running of Manchester United. The 8 years that Woodward has been in charge of the club have been filled with condemnations of his running of it, in footballing terms, namely his transfer dealings. In hindsight, the 2013 transfer window served as a bit of a precursor of what was to come. That summer saw Manchester United linked with plenty of players, only to pay £27.5 million for Marwan Fellaini on transfer deadline day. Supporters were underwhelmed. Here's an excerpt from a Laurie Whitwell article on The Athletic that sums things up nicely. The recruitment system, without Ferguson's alchemy, was flawed. A scout's recommendation for Atletico Madrid's Saúl Ñíguez, available then for £8 million, fell through the gaps, while Moyes rejected the one signing lined up, Thiago, because he was not personally familiar with the player. This pushes the idea that United is simply being run as a company in which, so long as the revenues are healthy, such as the commercial revenue channels that Woodward himself has contributed to the success of, then the on-pitch product can continue to be just good enough. And while United deserves plaudits for their off-pitch victories in the commercial revenue arena, their performance on the pitch is not where it's expected to be. Couple that with the debt that continues to pile up while the owners profit, and the looming shadow of frustration becomes more and more defined among supporters. From the very beginning of when the Glazers began to get involved with the club and all throughout their ownership of Manchester United, various facets of the United fan base have broken off in discontent. There was the group of fans that were opposed to the buyout that started FC United of Manchester, a team that initially competed in the North West Counties Football League, but has since moved up to the National League. There's also the Manchester United Supporters Trust, which was started in 1998 actually, in response to Rupert Murdoch's attempted Manchester United takeover bid, but has been ever-present and vocal against the Glazer family throughout. Their stated purpose is, quote, Our mission is to represent the interests of United fans whose continued passionate support is pivotal to the success of our team and to preserve the heritage of our club for future generations. Through our collective community, fans can have the meaningful influence at club and national level that they desire and deserve. The Supporters Trust has been trying for years to put control of the club back into the hands of the supporters, regularly encouraging fans to buy shares in the club and trying to facilitate a takeover of the club in 2010 via a group of wealthy investors called the Red Knights. Of course, there was the Love United, Hate Glazers, the LUHG movement, as well as the green and gold scarf seen as a sign of protest against the Glazers. The green and gold is representative of Newton Heath LYR Football Club, which, despite starting in 1878, later became Manchester United Football Club. The green and gold are a sign of protest in that they call back to the roots of Manchester United, basically, a way of showing that the fans don't identify with the current state of the club. The common frustration amongst all of this is how deeply in debt the Glazers' takeover put Manchester United, and yet on-pitch performance has dwindled despite the American owners managing to profit greatly from the club. It makes them question, who's winning, really, from this takeover? Later in this video, we will go over how they managed to profit annually, but let's look at how the debt was incurred and how it has fluctuated throughout the years. As mentioned briefly before, the Glazers' takeover was massively leveraged. Again, leveraged meaning that they borrowed a lot of money. I'm somewhat repeating that for myself so I don't forget. Thanks to JP Morgan and Ed Woodward securing high interest loans that were taken out against the assets of the club, not against the Glazers themselves. The Glazers put in £270 million of their own money, but the rest of their £790 million takeover was all borrowed at high interest rates. In January of 2010, Manchester United's debt had jumped all the way up to $716.5 million, thanks to the 14.25% interest that their untouched debt was collecting. On top of that, in August of 2010, the interest rate increased to 16.25% as the snowball effect well and truly took hold. Again, from David Kahn of The Guardian, the Glazers' takeover, designed by Woodward to load £540 million borrowings on a debt-free club, has since cost more than £1 billion in fees, refinancing penalties, and other dead money. Speaking to BBC Sport back in 2012, Ed Woodward looked at United's debt like this, quote, "Our debt, taking a house comparison, is like a mortgage, and it's small relative to the value of the business, and the person living inside it is getting richer and richer and richer in terms of income every year." Through various efforts to deal with the debt, 2010 saw some refinancing efforts making the club a publicly traded entity on the New York Stock Exchange in 2012, amongst other attempts. The amount of debt has fluctuated throughout the years. While some has paid off, others has been renegotiated at lower interest rates for the club to pay off. So, where does the club's debt stand now? Looking at their Securities and Exchange Commission filing from 2020, basically their financial report for those invested in Manchester United stocks, they have reported that their current indebtedness has increased to £525.6 million as of June 20th. On top of that, thanks to these visuals from RISC Vision, we can accurately see that their liabilities have been moved around in recent years. Liabilities could be anything from accounts payable to suppliers, player contracted payouts, and debt both in the long term and the short term. With this table from RISC Vision, on the surface, it looks as if Manchester United Football Club had halved their liabilities from £1 billion to £523 million from June of 2017 to June of 2018. But with a closer look, you can see that isn't the case at all. What they did was simply take some of their short-term liabilities that they would have to pay off sooner rather than later, and they shifted them into their long-term liabilities. Just as their short-term decreased by over £500 million, their long-term liabilities increased by £549.15 million in one financial year. All they did was simply buy themselves some more time by moving it. This shows just how fragile United's financial platform is. When the going is good, when there isn't a pandemic that prevents fans from entering the stadium, then their economic platform operates just well enough to be considered healthy by financial standards. But with the pandemic wreaking havoc, well, it's so tenuous that, as we saw, it causes their debt to increase once again. And yet the owners are still profiting. And so the most grating aspect of this debt So, as we mentioned earlier, Manchester United hadn't been in debt since 1931. And so the Glazers bringing on that incredible amount of debt was egregious enough in the eyes of the supporters. But a common accusation that United supporters hurl towards the Glazers is that they use the club as a cash machine, while the debt mounts and the results on the pitch most often flounder since Ferguson has left. How have they been able to profit? First off, let's look at how each of the 6 Glazer children are attached to the club using RISC Vision's Director ecosystem platform. From this large web that makes up Manchester United Football Club Limited, let's narrow our scope to just the board of directors. Alongside familiar names such as Sir Alex Ferguson, Sir Bobby Charlton, Ed Woodward, and others, all of Malcolm Glazer's 6 children are on the board of directors for Manchester United Football Club Limited. All 6 of them, despite Joel being considered the most involved of the siblings, involved in the day-to-day dealings of the club. How have the kids all profited? In 2010, it was revealed that the 6 children had collectively borrowed £10 million from the club, while also having been paid £10 million in management and administration fees. And then there's the moving of Manchester United's company registration from Manchester to the Cayman Islands in preparation of putting United on the New York Stock Exchange in 2012, to get the benefits of being in a tax haven. While this would suggest they were ready to relinquish some control of the club through the selling of shares, that wasn't the case at all. They divided the shares into 2 classes, Class A and Class B. The Class A shares are publicly traded on the stock exchange, while the Class B shares are not. They are the premium shares, so to speak. As this article from The Guardian in October 2019 states, the Glazers hold all of the B shares, which are not listed on the stock exchange but do accrue dividend payments and have 10 times the voting rights of the A shares. These dividend payments bring in money annually to the shareholders, and a good dividend payment is considered to be anywhere between 4 to 6%. The United shares pay out at 1.13%, which is not so lucrative unless you have tons of Class B shares like the Glazers do. Dividend payments have mostly gone to the Glazers over the years, pushing the narrative that they use the club as a cash cow. United's 2018-19 financial records showed that of the £23 million in dividend payments to shareholders, the Glazers collected £18 million. Even with Avram Glazer recently selling some of his shares to take the Glazer ownership of Manchester United down to 74.9%, they will still collect the £8.25 million biannually. And yes, even with the pandemic ongoing and calls for United to raise their staff wages to a livable working wage, the Glazers still collected their dividend payments in 2020. In fact, in working with RISC Vision, they found that in 2020, Red Football Limited, the parent company that pays out the dividends, looked to actually increase their dividend payments from £23.3 million to £44.5 million total, nearly double to that of what it was before. And if we go back to the SEC filing that was sent out to all of their investors, what was one of their fears from the pandemic? Under that same section in which they speak about their debt, they state, "Our indebtedness increases the risk that we may be unable to generate cash sufficient to pay amounts due in respect of our indebtedness. It could also have effects on our business. For example, it could limit our ability to pay dividends." Quite literally the first of their fears that comes up, which, to be fair, when you are sending this out to those that are investing in your club, it's going to be top of mind. But on top of that, closer to the bottom of the list, the very bottom of the list of how their debt could affect their operations, it says, affect our ability to compete for players and coaching staff, and limit our ability to borrow additional funds. So competing for signings will be difficult, as you may have gleaned from recent press conferences from Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and of course, as they are wont to do, the ability to borrow even more funds will be affected. Dividend payments, lack of signing players, and borrowing money. 3 things so closely associated with Manchester United these days. At this point, the Glazers have more than made back their £270 million that they contributed to acquire Manchester United. And as things stand, their net debt that sits on the club's books, again, not on the Glazers' books, sits at over £500 million. Those who oppose the Glazers point to these kinds of numbers, owners who collect their dividend payments, management and administration fees, and milk millions out of the club while also saddling it with debt, thanks to their takeover that they secured against the club's assets, not their own. Even through selling shares in the club, they ensured they wouldn't relinquish any control via their share class system. And of course, the fact that no other shareholders hold more than 10% of the stakes. The fact that United had a banker making football decisions provides in itself a strong synopsis of the issues supporters have had with the Glazer ownership. Yes, football has changed to become more business forward, but the fact that they haven't invested their own money into the club while profiting from it and increasing debt and dividend payments to over £1 billion is not a welcomed sight amongst fans. The money United spends is the money the club has earned thanks to its own brand appeal worldwide, not the owner's own outlays of cash. In fact, the owners pull the money out. They have built a model for profits to grow, but the ticket prices have increased alongside that, and the product on the pitch has, until recently perhaps, moved in the opposite direction, especially when comparing to that of, United's fiercest rivals, Manchester City, Liverpool, or even Chelsea. Their owners have invested their own cash into the club they preside over without collecting a salary or dividends, and coupled with their recent successes, the difference is very jarring. So far, it's difficult to see the Glazers' purchase of Manchester United as anything but for the benefit of their bank accounts, as opposed to the betterment of the club's trophy room. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Glazers and Manchester United's financials. Another big thank you to RISC Vision, who helped to produce this video with me. It was a massive undertaking, so do make sure to check them out, linked below. Beyond that, I thank you for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video. Take care.